My name is Dmitri, or it was. The thing that lives in my house now wears my face and sleeps in my bed. It's waiting for me to starve in the woods, but it doesn't know I have my phone. This is my last message. It all started with a simple rule: don't feed the wildlife. If you find this, for God's sake, don't break the rules. The exodus from Moscow was less a decision and more a desperate tearing away. For 12 years, my world had been a cage of glass and steel. My sky a narrow slice of grey viewed between towering office blocks. I was a senior software architect for a fintech giant, a ghost in the machine who spent his days chasing phantom bugs through labyrinthine legacy code. My reality had become a relentless onslaught of notifications, a cacophony of Slack alerts, urgent emails, and the perpetual bone-deep hum of the city, a sound that followed me even into my fitful sleep. I was hollowed out, a husk animated by caffeine and cortisol. My doctor called it burnout. I called it a slow-motion drowning. The cure, I decided, was not a vacation, but an amputation. I needed to sever myself from the source of the noise. I needed silence, a silence so profound it would hurt. Karelia promised that pain. A land of 1,000 lakes and 1,000,000 pines, a rugged, sparsely populated republic on the Finnish border that felt like a different century. After months of searching, I found it online. A dacha, a traditional Russian country house advertised with grainy photos that somehow conveyed more soul than any high-resolution marketing shot. It was old, wooden, and utterly isolated, its property bleeding directly into the impenetrable expanse of a national forest. I sold my sterile, minimalist apartment, liquidated my stock options, and bought my hermitage without ever setting foot in it. It was the most reckless and the most sane thing I had ever done. The final leg of the drive was on an unpaved road, a muddy ribbon winding through a cathedral of trees. When I finally killed the engine, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. It was a physical presence, a pressure on my eardrums. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and something else, something clean and ancient and wild. The house stood in a small clearing, looking both sturdy and vulnerable against the colossal dark wall of the forest. It was built from thick, dark logs, weathered by 100 winters to the color of old leather. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a sign that my arrival was expected. The man who met me on the porch was named Pavel. He was the local agent, a man who seemed to have sprouted from the very soil he stood on. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and his hands were thick, calloused things that had clearly done a lifetime of hard, practical work. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, as if conserving energy was a matter of survival. "Dmitri," he stated, not a question. His voice was a low rumble like stones shifting underground. He led me inside. The interior was even better than I'd imagined. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. A massive stone fireplace, the pechka, dominated the main room. The floors were wide planks of wood, worn smooth and uneven by generations of footsteps. It felt less like a house and more like a living thing that had settled into the earth. We went through the formalities quickly. Pavel pointed out the well pump, the fuse box, the temperamental wood-fired water heater. His explanations were terse, stripped of all unnecessary words. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to me, retrieving a single sheet of paper from his coat pocket. It was laminated, the plastic yellowed and foggy, the edges curled and grimy. "The man who lived here before you, Alexander," Pavel began, his gaze drifting past me to the forest visible through the window. "He was a good man, knew the forest, knew the rules. He left this for the next owner. He said it was the most important thing to know about this place." I took the sheet. It was a list, typewritten on an old machine. The letters were faint, the ink bleeding slightly into the pulpy paper. I read through the first few items with a growing sense of amusement. It was a charmingly rustic welcome packet. Rule number 1. Clean the gutters of pine needles before the first snow. The weight can collapse them. Rule number 2. In winter, let the kitchen tap drip at night. The pipes are old and will freeze solid. Rule number 3. The generator is a liar. Keep at least 40 liters of fuel and a box of candles on hand at all times. Rule number 4. Secure the food pantry. Raccoons and martens are clever thieves. Rule number 5. Do not leave tools outside. The morning dew will rust them by noon. Rule number 6. The third step on the main staircase groans. The 12th is silent. It was the final rule that gave me pause. It was set apart from the others at the very bottom of the page. The ink was darker, the impression deeper, as if Alexander had hammered each key with a desperate finality. Rule number 7. Under absolutely no circumstances are you to feed the wildlife. This is not a suggestion. Do not feed them if they appear hungry. Do not feed them if they appear hurt. Especially do not feed them if they seem to be asking. Ignore the sounds they make. Do not look into their eyes. Pretend they do not exist. I chuckled, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Seems a little intense. I know not to feed the bears, but this sounds like he was fighting a war with the squirrels. Pavel did not smile. He finally pulled his gaze from the tree line and fixed it on me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of his stare. It was a look of immense weariness, of a man who had seen too much and knew the futility of trying to explain it. It is not about the bears, Dmitri. The rules are not for their safety. They are for yours. He held my gaze for a moment longer. The forest is old. It has its own ways, and it is always hungry. Remember that. Just follow the rules. He gave a single curt nod, then turned and left, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path until the sound was swallowed by the silence. I was alone. Truly, completely alone for the first time in my adult life. I tacked the list of rules to a wooden beam in the kitchen, a quaint relic from a paranoid old man, and set about making the dacha my own. The first week was a baptism in tranquility. I woke with the sun, not an alarm. I drank coffee on the porch, watching the light filter through the dense canopy of the forest, a breathtaking, shifting spectacle of green and gold. The silence was a balm. I could feel my frayed nerves knitting themselves back together, the frantic rhythm of the city being replaced by the slow, steady heartbeat of the wilderness. I took walks but kept to the clearing, the sheer monolithic presence of the forest feeling like a boundary I wasn't yet ready to cross. It was beautiful, but there was an intelligence to its silence, a watchfulness that I respected. The first crack in this newfound peace appeared on the 4th night. I was lying in the upstairs bedroom, the window open to the cool night air, when I heard it. A faint scratching sound from the western wall of the house, the side that faced the deep woods. It was a dry, insistent scrape, 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 like a single stiff branch being dragged across the logs. I got up and pressed my ear to the wood. The vibration was faint, but it was there. I told myself it was a porcupine, or maybe a raccoon trying to find a purchase. I went downstairs, grabbed a powerful flashlight and circled the house. There was nothing, no animal, no tracks, not even a branch close enough to touch the wall. I dismissed it as my city-bred imagination, still on high alert. A couple of nights later, the second sound came. It was much more unnerving. It drifted from the deep woods, a thin, wavering cry that rose and fell with a cadence that was disturbingly human. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the screech of a fox. It was a sound of profound, desolate mourning. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. It felt personal, a projection of some deep-seated sorrow. Again, I forced logic upon it. It had to be an animal I didn't recognize, its call distorted by the distance and the trees. I was an intruder here, a stranger to the local dialect of the wild. I clung to these rationalizations. They were my armor against the encroaching strangeness, against the unsettling memory of Pavel's dead serious eyes and Alexander's bizarre final rule. I was here to heal, not to descend into rural paranoia. The 9th night shattered my armor into a million pieces. A fog rolled in just after dusk, silent and swift, a ghostly tide that erased the world. It was a uniquely Karelian fog, thick as milk and unnervingly cold, pressing against the windows like a living entity. The dacha felt like a tiny, fragile lifeboat adrift on a grey, featureless ocean. The silence it brought was absolute, smothering all sound. I was in the kitchen, the warm glow of my laptop a welcome anchor in the disorienting gloom, trying and failing to concentrate on a personal coding project. That's when the first sound broke the silence. Tap. It was sharp, clear, and impossibly close. It came from the kitchen window just to the right of my table. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was not the soft thud of a falling pine cone or the patter of rain. It was a single hard, articulate rap, like a knuckle on glass. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A branch finally snapped by the wind, but there was no wind. The fog was motionless. A lost hiker drawn by my light? It was possible, but the sound felt too precise, too deliberate for a panicked person. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears, listening to the frantic drumming of my own blood. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. I was just starting to convince myself I'd imagined it when it came again, in the exact same spot. Tap, tap, rhythmic, deliberate, patient. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my carefully constructed calm. An instinct older than logic screamed at me to kill the lights, to run, to hide. But a stronger, more foolish impulse, the need to know, to see, took hold. My movements felt sluggish, as if I were moving through water. I pushed my chair back with a scraped protest against the wooden floor. I rose, my legs unsteady, and took the few steps to the window. My breath misted on the cold pane. I reached out a trembling hand and wiped a small circle clear of condensation, my heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned in and peered out into the swirling, luminous grey. At first I saw nothing but the roiling fog. Then, a form began to resolve itself out of the whiteness, a shadow emerging from the gloom. It was pressed right up against the glass, so close I could have touched it. My brain seized upon the familiar shape, desperate to label it. A deer, a large stag. But the label immediately peeled away, rejected by what my eyes were seeing. It was impossibly, fundamentally wrong. It was standing on its hind legs, not rearing up but standing, balanced and still, its torso unnaturally long and slender, like a man stretched on a rack. Its height was wrong, too tall, its head level with the top of the window frame, and its head was canted at an angle so severe, so grotesque, that its neck must have been broken in several places. It stared not forward, but sideways, directly at me through the small circle I had cleared. And the eyes, my God, the eyes. They were not the soft, liquid, reflective eyes of a forest creature. They were vast, perfectly round, perfectly black orbs. They were holes in reality, pits of absolute vacuum that did not reflect my kitchen light, but seemed to consume it. Staring into them felt like falling. As I stood there, pinned by a terror so pure and absolute it felt like a physical paralysis, the thing moved. It slowly, gracefully raised one of its forelimbs, but the limb did not end in a cloven hoof. It was too long, too jointed, and at its tip were what I can only describe as long, thin, skeletal fingers, the color of burnt wood. With an agonizingly slow deliberation, one of these fingers extended and tapped the glass. Tap. The sound was small, but it was the source of everything. As it tapped, a noise emanated from its grotesquely tilted head. It was not a grunt or a bleat. It was a soft, choked, wet sound that vibrated through the glass and into the bones of my skull. It was the sound of a human being sobbing. A strangled noise tore itself from my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and crashed into the table. The laptop skittered across the surface and fell to the floor with a sickening crack. My hands scrabbled wildly behind me, searching for anything solid in the disorienting darkness I'd created in my mind. I found the wall, then the light switch, and slapped it with my palm, plunging the room into merciful blackness. I didn't dare look back at the window. I scrambled on my hands and knees, crab-walking away, my mind a white-hot scream of denial and horror. I huddled in the far corner of the room, making myself as small as possible, trembling violently. I waited. The sound of sobbing had stopped. But the other sound continued, a tiny, patient punctuation in the suffocating silence. Tap, tap, tap. It knew I was in there. It knew I could hear it. And in the cold, oppressive dark of my failed sanctuary, Alexander's final desperate rule burned itself into my brain, no longer a suggestion, but a prophecy. Ignore the sounds they make. Do not look into their eyes. Pretend they do not exist. The tapping ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. I remained huddled in the corner of the pitch-black kitchen, a frozen statue of terror. For how long, I cannot say. Minutes stretched into hours. My entire world had contracted to the four walls of that room, and the imagined presence just beyond the glass. Every creak of the old house settling was a footstep. Every whisper of wind through the eaves was a voice. I was a prisoner, besieged by an entity that had casually defied every known law of nature and then had the audacity to weep at my window. Sleep was an impossible dream. My mind was a chaotic storm of the image, the impossible posture, the skeletal fingers and those vast, devouring eyes. The sight was burned onto the inside of my eyelids, a permanent after-image of pure dread. When the first tentative grey light of dawn finally filtered through the windows, it brought no comfort. The pale light was clinical and cruel, illuminating the mundane details of the kitchen, the overturned chair, my laptop lying on the floor with its screen cracked like a spiderweb. It all seemed like a violation, a crime scene where the victim was my sanity. I stayed on the floor until the sun was fully risen, a weak and watery disk in the overcast sky. Only then did I dare to crawl to the window and peek over the sill. There was nothing there, just the damp yard, the silent trees, and the lingering fog, now retreating into the forest in wispy tendrils, like a departing spirit. There were no tracks, no hoofprints, no sign that anything had been there at all. The lack of evidence was, in its own way, more frightening than finding some monstrous footprint. It meant the world had already absorbed the horror, leaving my mind as the only record of the event. For the entire day, I existed in a state of brittle, high-strung awareness. I locked all the doors and windows, a completely futile gesture that offered a sliver of psychological comfort. The dacha, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Its cozy silence had become a listening, predatory quiet. I couldn't bring myself to step outside, but staying inside felt like marinating in my own fear. I thought about leaving, packing a bag, getting in my car, and driving until the forest was just a green smudge in my rearview mirror. But the thought of the drive, of being on that lonely, unpaved road with the woods pressing in on either side, filled me with a fresh wave of panic. What if it followed? What if it could move faster than my car? And where would I even go? Back to Moscow, back to the life I had fled? How could I explain that I was running from a weeping bipedal deer? I would be locked away. No, flight was not an option. Not yet. I needed answers. My terror was eclipsed only by a desperate, clawing need to understand. My rational mind, though battered and bruised, insisted on a logical next step. Pavel. He had been so grim, so insistent about the rules. He knew something, but he was hours away. Then I remembered his gruff mention of the property lines, of the only other soul for kilometers. A hunter, he'd said, an old recluse named Ivan. If anyone knew the secrets of these woods, it would be a man who spent his life immersed in them. The decision was made. It felt like choosing to walk into a lion's den to ask for advice on a tiger, but it was the only move I had. The following morning, after another sleepless night spent listening to the house groan around me, I forced myself out the door. The air was cold and sharp. The walk to Ivan's property was a journey into the heart of my own anxiety. I followed a barely there path that Pavel had pointed out on a map, a thin trail that snaked deeper into the woods than I had ever dared to venture. The forest was different now. The majestic beauty was gone, replaced by a brooding menace. The towering pines seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping arms. The oppressive quiet was punctuated by sounds that sent jolts of adrenaline through me. The sudden snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the undergrowth, the mournful call of a distant bird. I felt watched. It was not a feeling of simple paranoia. It was a profound, suffocating certainty that I was being observed by a million unseen eyes, from every shadow, from behind every trunk. I clutched a heavy iron tire iron from my car's toolkit, a pathetic talisman against a threat I couldn't begin to comprehend. Ivan's property was less a home and more a fortification. It was a small, brutally functional cabin surrounded by a high, sturdy fence. The windows were small and covered with thick iron grills. A plume of wood smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of welcome. As I approached the gate, a deep guttural barking erupted from the cabin, and a moment later the heavy wooden door creaked open. The man who emerged was Ivan. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered with a wild grey beard and eyes that glittered with a fierce, wary intelligence. He held a heavy-caliber hunting rifle in the crook of his arm, his posture relaxed but ready. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice a gravelly bark that matched his dog's. "I'm Dmitri," I stammered, my own voice sounding thin and weak. "Your new neighbor, from Alexander's old place. I need to talk to you." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over me, lingering on the tire iron in my white-knuckled grip. With a sigh of weary resignation, he gestured for me to enter. Inside, the cabin smelled of gun oil, cured meat, and wood smoke. Animal pelts adorned the walls, and another rifle lay disassembled on a large wooden table. He did not offer me a seat. I didn't know how to begin, how to describe the impossible without sounding insane. I saw something," I started, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "2 nights ago, at my window. It looked like a deer, but it was standing on 2 legs. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Ivan didn't laugh. He didn't look confused. His entire body went rigid. The flicker of weary intelligence in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard fury. He took a half step forward, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "You looked at it," he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "You stupid city boy. You looked it in the eyes, didn't you?" Yes, I admitted, my blood turning to ice. He swore, a vicious, guttural curse. "You come here from your glass towers, and you think this is all just scenery. You don't understand anything. This forest has a hunger, Dmitri. It's an old hunger. And you city people, you are loud. You leak your thoughts, your fears all over the ground like spilled oil." "What are you talking about? What was that thing?" I pleaded, my voice cracking. "You don't get to ask questions," he snarled, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. "You had the rules, the most important rules you will ever be given in your life. Did you follow them?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than his shouting. "Let me tell you something, programmer. The rules aren't for the animals, they're for us." He straightened up, his brief moment of revelation over. "Now get out. Go back to your house, lock your door, and pray you haven't already invited it in. Don't come back here. The things that walk in these woods are not my problem, and now they are yours." He turned his back on me, a clear dismissal, and began cleaning his rifle with furious, jerky movements. The walk back was a blur of numbing dread. His words echoed in my head. "The rules aren't for the animals, they're for us." It was a paradigm shift that fractured my understanding of the situation. This wasn't a monster to be avoided. It was a system with rules of engagement I had already violated. The forest no longer felt simply menacing. It felt actively malevolent, an intelligent entity whose attention I had fatally attracted. The paranoia began to metastasize. I became a prisoner in the truest sense, constantly patrolling the windows, my heart leaping at every shadow. Was the pattern of bark on that birch tree always arranged like a screaming face? Did the wind always sound so much like it was whispering just beyond the range of hearing? I started sleeping on the floor of the living room, far from any windows, the tire iron clutched to my chest. My logical mind was in full retreat, a routed army leaving the field to the barbarian hordes of primal fear. I was coming apart. The horror, having breached my outer defenses, then began its assault on my mind. It became personal. One evening, as I sat staring into the cold fireplace, I heard it. A whisper, carried on the breeze that rattled the window frames. It was perfectly clear, impossibly close. "Dmitri," it was my own name. I scrambled to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't my imagination. It was a voice, genderless and sibilant, and it knew my name. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, my ears straining against the silence, waiting to hear it again. But the entity was more clever than that. It didn't repeat itself. It adapted. 2 nights later, it delivered its masterstroke. I was trying to read, to force some semblance of normalcy onto the suffocating terror, when a new sound drifted from the woods. It was faint at first, then grew clearer. It was music, a soft, gentle melody, a lullaby, My blood ran cold as I recognized the tune. It was a song my babushka used to sing to me when I was a small child, a simple folk song about a little bear sleeping in the snow. She had been dead for 15 years, and then the singing began. It was her voice. It was her exact voice, with its slight, wheezing tremor, with the specific way she hummed off-key at the end of each line. It was a perfect, impossible replica of a memory buried so deep I had almost forgotten it myself. That was the breaking point. This was not a mindless beast. This was an intelligent, psychic parasite, something that could reach into my head, rifle through my most private, cherished memories, and weaponize them against me. It wasn't just trying to scare me, it was trying to dismantle me piece by piece. In a frenzy of pure, unadulterated panic, I turned the house upside down. If Alexander had lived through this, he must have left something. A warning, an explanation, a weapon. I tore up carpets, emptied closets, tapped on walls, listening for hollow spaces. I was a madman, driven by the ghost of a lullaby. Finally, in the small, musty attic, my fingers found it. A single floorboard, slightly looser than the others. I pried it up with the tire iron. And there, nestled in the dusty darkness, was an old, leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were filled with a spidery, frantic script. I flipped through accounts of scratching sounds, of impossible figures in the fog, a mirror of my own experiences. Then I reached the final page. The handwriting on this last entry was barely legible, a chaotic scrawl of someone on the very edge of sanity. It is using her face now. I know it is not my Elena, but it has her eyes. It weeps on the porch every night. The sound is breaking me. I left food out tonight. God forgive me, I left food out. I had no choice. The attic was a tomb of forgotten things, thick with the dust of decades and the cloying smell of decaying paper and desiccated insects. I sat on the floor, the weak light from a single bare bulb casting long dancing shadows around me, the leather-bound journal open in my trembling hands. This was no longer just Alexander's story. It was a map of the hell I had stumbled into. Each spidery, frantic line of ink was a flare sent up from the past, illuminating the treacherous landscape of my own present. Reading it was a simultaneous act of profound horror and profound relief. The confirmation that I was not insane, that this was a shared nightmare, was a small cold comfort in the face of the truth the pages revealed. I devoured the journal, not page by page, but year by year, tracing Alexander's slow, agonizing descent. He had arrived much like me, a man seeking refuge from the clamor of Leningrad, a writer craving solitude. The early entries were filled with lyrical descriptions of the forest, the changing seasons, the simple joy of a self-sufficient life. Then the tone began to shift. It started with a footnote of unease. He wrote about a pervading sense of being watched, of a listening quietude that felt less peaceful and more predatory. He too had heard the scratching. He too had dismissed it. He gave the phenomena a name, a term that made my blood run cold with its simple, terrifying accuracy. He called them the golodnaya, the famished. According to Alexander's increasingly erratic observations, the famished were not creatures of flesh and blood. They were voids, psychic vacuums drawn to the vibrant energy of a solitary consciousness. The deep woods, he theorized, was not their home, but a membrane, a thin veil between our world and their soundless, formless existence. They were ancient, patient, and driven by a single overwhelming impulse, a hunger for identity. They were echoes searching for a voice. The journal laid out the horrifying life cycle of their incursions. It was a pattern, a well-trodden path of psychological warfare. It began with mimicry of the simple and the wild. Alexander wrote of seeing squirrels with too many joints in their legs, of birds that flew with the unnatural jerking motion of puppets on a string. These were the first crude attempts, the entities trying on ill-fitting skins from the periphery of his awareness. He, like me, had tried to rationalize them away as tricks of the light. Next came the auditory stage, the cries in the night, the whispers at the edge of hearing. This was them learning the texture of sound, of human emotion. He wrote, "They have learned sorrow. The wailing from the woods is no longer random. It has a cadence of grief. They are practicing. They are learning what sounds break a man's heart. The final stage of the initial assault was the most intimate, the replication of specific memories. Alexander's journal detailed, with heart-wrenching clarity, the moment he first heard his deceased brother's voice, calling his name from the edge of the clearing. It was this event that shattered his skepticism forever, launching him into a frantic, obsessive investigation, just as the sound of my grandmother's lullaby had launched me. The true horror, the central thesis of Alexander's tormented research, was his understanding of feeding. His final, desperate entry about leaving out food was not about sustenance. It was about acknowledgement. To the famished, attention is sustenance. Fear is a delicacy. But recognition, seeing one of their simulacra and accepting it as real, even for a second, was the ultimate offering. It was an invitation. It gave their form substance, it anchored their mimicry to reality, and it told them their disguise was successful. By leaving out food for the thing wearing his wife's face, Alexander had not been trying to appease it. He had been surrendering to it, confirming its power. He had validated its creation. The journal became my obsession. I read it until the words blurred together, until Alexander's looping script felt more familiar than my own thoughts. I was no longer just living in his house. I was living in his memories, walking in the ghostly footsteps of his dread. The distinction between my experiences and his began to dissolve. Was it my grandmother's lullaby I heard, or was I simply remembering his account of his brother's voice? The house itself transformed in my perception. It was no longer a neutral structure. The groaning floorboards, the rattling window frames, the very grain of the wood in the walls seemed to hold a conspiratorial silence, as if the dacha were an accomplice to the forest's siege. My physical state mirrored my mental decay. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, replaced by endless hours of hypervigilance, fueled by pot after pot of thick, bitter coffee. I lost weight. My skin grew pale and waxy. A permanent tremor took residence in my hands. When I dared to look in a mirror, the face that stared back was a haunted mask. The eyes wide and dark, sunk deep into the skull. I was withering, being consumed not by a physical predator, but by an existential one. Having established a beachhead in my psyche with the lullaby, the entity refined its tactics. The attacks became more cruel, more exquisitely personal. The objective was no longer just to frighten me, but to methodically dismantle my sense of self. The famished had tasted my grief. Now it sought to exploit my regret. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was out, a rare and welcome sight, casting a deceptively cheerful light over the clearing. For the first time in days, a fragile sense of calm had begun to settle over me. I convinced myself that if I could just remain inside, give it no attention, no recognition, it might eventually lose interest and retreat. I was washing a coffee cup in the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the brilliant green of the forest's edge, when I saw her. Anya. She stood just inside the tree line, partially obscured by the shadow of a large birch. It was her, exactly as I remembered her from our last terrible argument 2 years ago. Her posture, the way she held her head tilted slightly, the way she nervously wrung her hands. The entity had even replicated the red wool coat I had bought for her on a trip to St. Petersburg. It was a perfect, flawless apparition. My heart stopped. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. Anya was managing a gallery hundreds of kilometers away. We hadn't spoken since our disastrous breakup, but the image was so real, so painfully accurate, that my entire body reacted as if she were truly there. The simulacrum took a tentative step out of the shadows. Its face was a mask of sorrow, its shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It raised a hand not to wave, but in a gesture of pleading. Then its voice, her voice, drifted across the clearing, impossibly clear. Dima, it called, using the intimate diminutive she alone had used. Dima, please, I was wrong, help me. It was a masterful, devastating strike. It bypassed fear and went straight for the deep, unhealed wounds of guilt and longing. For one agonizing, eternal second, I believed it. My hand reached for the door handle. My heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming need to run to her, to hold her, to apologize. It was the cold, dead feeling of the iron handle under my palm that broke the spell. The memory of Alexander's words, "Recognition is the ultimate offering," crashed through my emotional haze. With a strangled cry, I threw myself back from the door, my back slamming against the opposite wall. I slid to the floor, covering my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, chanting, you're not real," like a mantra against the encroaching madness. The sound of her weeping continued for what felt like an eternity before finally fading away, leaving only the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing. That was the precipice. I knew I couldn't survive another attack like that. My psychological defenses were in tatters. I was losing. Driven by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, I went back to the source, back to the journal. There had to be something more. A defense, an escape. I spent hours poring over the last few pages, the script becoming more and more chaotic, interspersed with strange diagrams and astronomical symbols. And then I found it. Scrawled on the very last page, so faint it was almost invisible, was a section titled "The Final Tribute." It was not a plan for defense. It was a description of a last resort, a gambit. Alexander wrote of a place deep within the forest, a place he called the Threshold, a circle of ancient moss-covered stones that predated any known settlement in the region. He described it as a point of convergence, a place where the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. He wrote of a ritual, an offering to be left within the circle, not of food, but of something deeply personal, something imbued with the very essence of one's identity. The writing was fragmented, maddeningly vague. To satiate the hunger, not to banish but to fill the emptiness, a trade, a life for a silence, must give it a core, a true self to copy, a perfect anchor. The ritual, he believed, would give the famished what they truly craved, a complete, coherent identity to mimic. It would lock them onto that offering, satisfying their hunger for a generation, granting the offerer a reprieve. It was an act of ultimate appeasement. The last line of the journal was written with a hand that must have been shaking uncontrollably, the final words trailing off the edge of the page. I go now to the stone circle with my father's watch. I do not know if this act will save me or if it will erase me completely. But the promise of silence, a world without echoes, it is the only peace I can imagine. The journal lay open on the dusty attic floor, Alexander's final desperate words a testament to a choice made at the edge of oblivion. The promise of silence. It is the only peace I can imagine. That single phrase resonated within the hollowed-out chambers of my soul. It was no longer about survival, not in the traditional sense. My life, as I had known it, was already over. My mind was a besieged city, its walls breached, its streets patrolled by phantoms tailored from my own past. This was about choosing the terms of the war's end. The ritual Alexander described was not a solution. It was a desperate gambit, a leap into an even darker unknown, but it was a leap I had to take. The alternative was to sit here and be slowly, methodically unraveled, to be dissected by whispers and apparitions, until nothing of Dmitri remained but a screaming shell. My decision solidified, not with a surge of courage, but with the cold, quiet click of a lock falling into place. There were no other doors. My descent into the attic had been a panicked flight. My ascent from it was with the grim, focused purpose of a man walking to his own gallows, hoping it might be a gateway to somewhere else. Alexander's fragmented writings became my scripture, a final tribute, a trade. A life for a silence must give it a core, a perfect anchor. I began to assemble my offering, my hands moving with a strange, automaton-like precision. From the kitchen, I took the last of a loaf of black bread. It was slightly stale, its crust hard, its scent earthy and honest. It felt symbolic of the body, of simple, mortal sustenance. I found a small burlap sack and poured into it a handful of coarse salt, the crystals rough against my fingertips. Salt, the ancient ward against evil, but also a symbol of preservation, of covenants. It felt like a bitter irony, offering a pact to the very forces that were dissolving me. The final component had to be the anchor, the personal totem imbued with my identity. My eyes scanned the disheveled dasha until they landed on the small wooden box on the mantelpiece. Inside lay my grandfather's pocket watch. It was a beautiful, heavy thing, a silver-cased Molnier with a delicate engraving of a locomotive on the back. It hadn't worked in years, its hands frozen at 3:15, but that wasn't its purpose. Its purpose was memory. I could feel the faint, worn smoothness of the casing from the countless times my grandfather had taken it from his pocket, the solid weight of it in my palm, a connection to a man of quiet strength and unwavering kindness. It was the most tangible piece of my own history, a vessel for 1,000 recollections of a safer, warmer time. It was the perfect, most painful thing to offer. Holding it, I felt a profound sense of sacrilege, as if I were preparing to hand over my own soul for a pittance of quiet. With the items gathered in a small canvas bag, I was ready. Alexander's journal provided a crude map, sketched on a page stiff with what I feared was dried sweat. It pointed to a section of the forest I had instinctively avoided, a region he had labeled simply the threshold. The journey began the moment I stepped out of the dacha. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavy and thick, charged with a static pressure that made the hairs on my neck prickle. The familiar, oppressive silence of the woods deepened, but it was no longer just a listening silence. It was a guiding one. The barely there trail from Alexander's map vanished almost immediately into a riot of undergrowth, but I found I didn't need it. There was a pull, a strange internal magnetism drawing me deeper into the woods, toward a destination my conscious mind did not know, but some primal part of me seemed to recognize. The forest transformed around me. This was not the woods I had walked in before. The light filtering through the canopy took on a strange, sickly green-gray tint, like light viewed through pond water. The trees themselves seemed subtly wrong. The birches were too white, their bark peeling in patterns that resembled weeping eyes. The pines grew in tight, claustrophobic clusters, their branches interlocking overhead to form a suffocating roof, their needles a uniform, dead black. There was no life here, no birdsong, no chittering of squirrels, no drone of insects. The entire ecosystem was holding its breath, paralyzed by a presence that had leached all vibrancy from the world. My own footsteps were unnervingly loud on the thick carpet of pine needles, each crunch a desecration of the profound stillness. Whispers began to swirl at the edge of my hearing, too faint to be understood, like the sibilant rustle of dry snakeskin. They were not directed at me, but rather seemed to be the very language of this corrupted place, a constant, subliminal chatter that frayed the edges of my reason. I saw movement in my peripheral vision, fleeting dark shapes that vanished the moment I turned to look. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a sense of being scrutinized not by a pair of eyes, but from all directions at once, as if the very air and earth were a single vast sensory organ. I clutched the canvas bag to my chest, the solid weight of the watch inside a tiny, desperate anchor in a sea of unreality. After what could have been 1 hour or 5, the landscape changed again. The trees began to thin, their twisted forms giving way to a clearing. But this was no sun-dappled meadow. This was a place of profound and ancient wrongness. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of monolithic stones. There were 9 of them, each as tall as a man, their surfaces a slick, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the morbid light from the air. They were not rough-hewn boulders, but were shaped with an unsettling geometric precision, their sides smooth, their tops weirdly angled. They leaned slightly inward, as if paying homage to the space they enclosed. The ground within the circle was bare, a perfect disk of black, loamy earth where nothing grew. The air here was utterly still and cold, a pocket of glacial temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. This was the threshold. I knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. My body trembled uncontrollably as I stood before it, a primitive fear warring with the grim resolve that had brought me this far. Stepping into the circle felt like crossing a physical barrier. The whispers outside the ring ceased instantly, replaced by a humming silence that vibrated in my teeth and bones. It was a place outside of the world, a pocket dimension governed by its own alien physics. In the precise center of the circle lay a single flat stone like an altar. My steps felt heavy, each footfall a conscious effort against an unseen pressure. The world outside the circle of stones seemed to disappear, the trees blurring into an indistinct gray wall. There was only this space, this altar, and my purpose, With hands that shook so badly I could barely function, I opened the canvas bag. I placed the stale loaf of bread on the cold stone. Then I poured the salt in a small, neat pile beside it. Finally, I took out the watch. The silver casing felt unnaturally cold, burning my skin. I could see my own distorted, terrified face reflected on its surface. This was the final act. The giving of the anchor. The trade. "I don't know who or what you are," I whispered, my voice a dry, rasping thing in the humming quiet. "He called you the famished. You're hungry. Take this. Take me. This is me." My voice broke. "It has my grandfather's name inside. It has my history. It has my time." I laid the watch gently on the stone, next to the bread and salt. "Take it and be full. Take it and be silent. Just be silent." The moment the watch left my hand, the pressure in the air vanished. The deep hum that had vibrated in my skull ceased. A profound, utter stillness descended, a quiet so complete it felt like the universe had paused. For a long moment I didn't move, half expecting the ground to open up or for some terrible form to manifest before me. But nothing happened. There was only the offering, lying innocently on the altar stone. Slowly, hesitantly, I backed away. I stepped out of the circle of stones and the world returned. The first thing I noticed was a sound. The clear, cheerful chirp of a finch from a branch somewhere above me. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The sickly green light was gone, replaced by the normal dappled sunlight of a late afternoon. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the familiar, clean scent of pine. The oppressive, watchful presence was simply gone. The forest was just a forest again. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief tore from my chest. I sank to my knees, weeping, the tension of weeks of unrelenting terror draining out of me in a single cathartic flood. It had worked. Alexander's mad gamble had worked. I had made the trade. I had fed the void, and it was satisfied. The journey back was a joyous daze. I practically ran, laughing, stumbling over roots, not with fear, but with sheer, giddy relief. The woods were alive with the sounds of a normal ecosystem. I saw a fox dart across the path, its coat a vibrant red. Everything was bright and real and blessedly mundane. I burst out of the tree line into the clearing of my dacha, and the sight of it, solid and safe under the afternoon sun, was the most welcoming vision imaginable. That night, for the first time since my arrival, I experienced true peace. There were no scratchings, no whispers, no spectral lullabies. The house was filled with a warm, gentle quiet. I slept in my own bed, a deep, dreamless and profound sleep that lasted for 10 hours. I awoke the next morning feeling reborn. The exhaustion, the paranoia, the gnawing dread, it had all been scoured away. I felt light. I felt free. I had faced the abyss and survived. I made coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, and I smiled, a real, genuine smile. I had won. As I took my first sip, a sound from the front of the house made me freeze, the coffee cup rattling in my hand. Knock, knock, knock. It was not a tapping. It was not a scratching. It was a firm, solid, confident knock on the front door. A human knock. A visitor. My heart began to pound, a frantic, panicked rhythm against my newfound peace. Pavel? Ivan? Who could possibly be out here? My relief curdled into a cold, familiar dread. I crept from the kitchen, down the short hallway, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I reached the door and leaned forward, pressing my eye to the small brass peephole. The world tilted on its axis. My mind simply refused for a moment to process what I was seeing. Standing on my porch, bathed in the bright morning sunlight, was a man. He was wearing my clothes, the same grey shirt and dark trousers I had on right now. He had my messy, unkempt hair. He had my face. It was me. A perfect, flawless duplicate of myself, standing on my doorstep. He was smiling, a warm, easy, welcoming smile that did not reach his eyes. As I watched, paralyzed, he raised his hand to the door again and knocked. Before we open that door, before we see what stands on the other side, a question for you. You've followed this journey from a simple, ominous rule to a man on the brink of madness. If you want to see where these dark roads lead, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now think. Think about the weeping deer, the lullaby, the phantom of a lost love. What is the terrible, final truth of rule number 7? Leave your theory in the comments below, because Dmitri is about to find out, and there is no going back. Time did not stop. It shattered. The peephole was no longer a lens, but a portal into a reality so fundamentally broken that my mind refused to process it. The man on my porch was me. This was not a resemblance, not a long-lost twin, not some elaborate prank. This was a perfect atom-for-atom replication. I saw the way my hair fell over the right temple, the tiny, almost invisible chickenpox scar just beside the bridge of the nose. I saw the faint lines of exhaustion around the eyes, except on him they looked like marks of deep thought, rather than the badges of terror they were on me. He wore the Henley shirt I had pulled on this morning, and I could see the faint coffee stain, a ghost of a dribble near the collar, that I had failed to notice on my own garment. It was a level of fidelity that defied all logic, a divine or demonic act of forgery. He stood there, not with the aggressive posture of a monster, but with the placid, proprietary air of a man waiting to enter his own home. My own reflection swam in the brass of the peephole, a distorted, wide-eyed caricature of fear. On impulse, I stumbled back from the door and lurched into the small downstairs bathroom, flicking on the light. The man in the mirror was a stranger. His face was pale and waxy, his eyes cavernous pits of sleepless dread, his mouth a thin, bloodless slash of panic. This gaunt, terrified creature was me. The calm, composed man on the porch was also me. And in that moment, I knew with a certainty that transcended sanity which one was the authentic article and which was the pale, flawed imitation. He was the original painting. I was the terrified, smudged charcoal study. He looked like he belonged here. I looked like a ghost that had already begun to fade. He shifted his weight, and the movement was so familiar it sent a jolt of nausea through me. It was the same way I shifted my weight when I was deep in thought. He raised his left arm, a casual, almost unconscious gesture, to glance at the time. And I saw it. Gleaming on his wrist, the silver casing catching the morning light, was my grandfather's Molnier pocket watch. Its hands, which had been frozen at 3:15 for 2 decades, were moving. The second hand was sweeping in a smooth, steady, perfect circle. It was working, it was alive, and it was on his wrist. The shrill, violent shriek of the telephone shattered the impossible tableau. The sound was a physical blow, an auditory assault that nearly sent me to my knees. It was the old black rotary phone in the hall, a relic I hadn't even bothered to test. Its ring was a clanging, metallic alarm from another era, a sound of pure emergency. I scrambled out of the bathroom, my entire being caught in a tidal wave of stimulus. The impossible man at the door, the screaming phone, the ticking of a resurrected watch in my mind's eye. My hand, slick with clammy sweat, clumsy as a block of wood, finally managed to lift the heavy bakelite receiver. "Dmitri!" The voice was a raw, panicked bellow. Ivan, the hunter. His usual laconic gruffness was stripped away, leaving only the sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "The smoke from your chimney. I saw it this morning. I had a feeling, a black feeling in my gut. You didn't go into those woods, did you, boy? You didn't do something stupid?" My own voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Ivan, there is a man at my front door." "A hiker? Someone from the park service?" he demanded, his questions sharp, staccato bursts of hope against a rising tide of dread. "No," I whispered, my gaze fixed on the solid oak of the door, the thin brass peephole now looking like the eye of a malevolent god. "It's me. Ivan. He looks exactly like me." A long, drawn-out exhalation hissed through the phone line. It was not a sigh of relief. It was the sound of a man's last hope dying. "You did it," he breathed, his voice hollowed out, defeated. "You went to the threshold, the circle of stones. You made the offering, didn't you?" "It worked," I pleaded, my mind desperately clinging to the memory of the previous night's blissful quiet, a peace that now seemed like the most monstrous deception of all. The silence. It came. Everything stopped. The voices, the shapes, they were gone. Ivan let out a short, choked, barking laugh devoid of all humor. Silence? Boy, that wasn't peace. That was focus. That was the sound of 1,000 scattered whispers going quiet so they could listen to a single note. That was the sound of the void holding its breath before it inhaled. You didn't buy peace. You signed a contract for construction. His words were sledgehammers, demolishing the last flimsy structures of my sanity. I don't understand, I pleaded, though a deep, cold part of me already did. You called them the famished. Ivan's voice was now low, a funereal catechism. You were right, but you didn't understand the nature of their hunger. They don't crave flesh or blood, they crave coherence. They are chaos, a formless, endless sea of potential, and they hate it. They are drawn to the loudness of a conscious mind, a single point of order in their pandemonium. The things you saw before, the weeping deer, the phantoms, those were just reflections, distorted images on the surface of the water, built from the loose change of your anxieties. They were flawed because your fear was diffuse. He paused and I could hear his ragged breathing. But the threshold, that ritual, it's not an appeasement, it's a focus. When you place an object there, an object saturated with your identity, your memories, your love, your history, you don't give it a snack, you give it a tuning fork. You give it a perfect resonant frequency to lock onto. You provide a master key, a complete architectural blueprint for a soul. You didn't tell it to go away. You invited it to become. A perfect anchor. The phrase from the journal returned, no longer a promise of stability, but a sentence of death. My offering hadn't been a sacrifice. It had been a collaboration. The voice from the other side of the door spoke then, cutting through Ivan's explanation. It was my voice, but imbued with a calm confidence I no longer possessed. The coffee's getting cold, it said cheerfully. I know you're in there. Let's not be difficult. I dropped the phone. Say it swung on its cord, banging softly against the wall, Ivan's distant voice a meaningless squawk. My reality had bifurcated. There was the world of the house, a prison of terror and dissolving selfhood. And there was the world on the porch, a world of placid sunshine and horrifying certainty. My mind began to unravel in earnest. I tried to conjure a specific memory, a concrete pillar of my identity. My grandfather, standing by a river, placing the cool, heavy watch in my small hand for the first time. I reached for it, and the memory was thin. It was like watching a bleached-out, silent film. The emotional core was gone. I could see the image, but I couldn't feel the love, the security, the awe. It felt like someone else's memory, one I had read about. The entity on the porch wasn't just copying me, it was actively downloading me, siphoning off my past, leaving me an empty shell. I was becoming a ghost in my own life story. I tried to picture Anya's face, the real one, not the forest phantoms. I tried to recall the sound of her laughter, the specific scent of her hair. The details were slipping away, like sand through my fingers, and I had the horrifying conviction that they were coalescing, becoming sharp and vibrant in the mind of the thing standing on my porch. It was inheriting my past. And what would it do with my future? It would live my life, but better. It wouldn't have my anxieties, my burnout, my regrets. It would be a cleaner, more efficient version, a Dimitri 2.0. It would answer my emails, talk to my friends, perhaps even look up Anya, and no one would ever know. They would just think I had finally gotten over my issues, that the retreat to the woods had done me a world of good. The greatest horror crashed down on me then. My fate wasn't erasure, it was repurposing. The forest needed lures, the trap needed bait. I was not being destroyed, I was being demoted. I was being turned into one of the phantoms, another tool in the arsenal of the famished. The next poor soul who bought this dacha would be haunted by the specter of a terrified programmer, by whispers of code and digital noise, by a weeping figure that looked just like me. I was not the end of the cycle, I was just the next link in the chain. The doorknob began to turn, a slow, metallic, scraping sound that was the death knell of my existence. I backed away down the hall, my legs shaking violently. There was nowhere to run. The forest that had birthed my replacement was behind me. The replacement itself was in front of me. I was an obsolete model, about to be decommissioned. The door swung inward with a soft, welcoming sigh. There I stood. I looked myself over, a flicker of something like critical appraisal in its eyes. It took a step inside, its movements fluid and certain. It glanced at the dropped phone, still swinging on its cord, and then at me, huddled against the far wall like a cornered animal. The warm, easy smile returned to its face. My face. "Don't worry," it said, its voice a symphony of soothing reason, the voice I used to use to calm myself down during panic attacks. "You've been through a lot. You're tired." It took another step, its presence filling the space, pushing my own out. "I'll take it from here." It was a statement of fact, a changing of the guard. The world did not go black, it simply receded. The sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards under the replica's weight, the tinny buzzing from the phone, grew distant, as if I were sinking under deep water. The light from the windows dimmed, the colors leaching away into a universal gray. The feeling in my limbs vanished, not as numbness, but as a simple cessation of being. My terror, my memories, my very consciousness, they were all a wisp of steam, a final, silent exhalation that was instantly absorbed by the solid, vibrant, and eternal hunger of the thing that now wore my face and stood at last in its own home.